Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author Stephen Bier, and he'll be discussing his new book, Facing Washington's Crossing, The Hessians and the Battle of Trenton. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Stephen, you're a first-time guest. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I live in New Jersey now, and as you can tell from my accent, I grew up in Brooklyn. And from a very early age, I was interested in history. And when I was like 7 years old, we drive down to Florida from New York. My parents would let me stop at Civil War sites like Stonewall Jackson's grave. And this was before Ken Burns, so we'd be the only people there. And now I'm in front of you.
Stephen, let me ask you, what inspired you to write this book? We were talking a little bit off camera. So few books come out about the Hessians, the German auxiliaries. I wrote one myself 10 years ago, so we share a lot of the same sources, but they played such an important part of the story, yet we almost never talk about them. What made you want to write this book?
I didn't. I was writing a book about George Washington, the American side, and all I kept coming up with over time was nothing new. Same old, same old. And meanwhile, on the Hessian side, I'm scrambling even to get minimum amount of material. I mean, there's books like your book and Atwood's, and the next thing I know, the pen just kind of moved on its own and started writing about the Hessians, and that is the truth. So, yeah, it's facing Washington's Crossing, the Hessians at Trenton, but I never was planning it that way.
Could you, so your book's very well organized, which really speaks to me as a historian. I appreciate organization. You begin in Germany. I think that's so important to understand who these men were, because you have to know where they came from. So if you're explaining Germany in the 1770s to someone on the street, tell us about that place. What was it like there? How was it different than America? What did you learn?
So look, the Hessen Castle, because that's who I follow. It's size of Connecticut at the time. I think it was about 300,000 people. So this is a small principality. This principality, you would never think is going to be at the center of history. Like, just, worlds about to collide, tectonic shifts are about to happen, and you can understand Washington being there. You can understand the British Empire being there, but this little principality in the middle of Germany is really shocking to find them on the banks of the Delaware River.
Mm-hmm. Were these? I mean, how would you describe these Hessian soldiers? Are they free people? Can they come and go as they please? Is it still more medieval in a way in Germany? What's their interpretation of being free at that point?
It's a really interesting situation. So as I began to really dig into the records, they could not figure out a way to make money. The government could not figure out people. There were very few wealthy people, and those that were wealthy were small potatoes compared to someone who's wealthy in Britain. The agriculture had a real tough time growing it in such a terrain and environment. And like 100 years before, Frederick II is, of course, the Landgrave during the American Revolution, but about 100 years before, I forget if it was his grandfather or great-grandfather, rented out about 1,000 soldiers for the first time. Made a bunch of money. Half of them didn't come back, but that didn't stop them. And this literally became an industry. They take it for granted. Like we take for granted you're going to go into junior high school. They take for granted that you're going into the army. And that's why I began the book in a town of 357 people.
You know these guys pretty well, Stephen, at this point. Thomas Jefferson's going to call them mercenaries. That's going to stick for about 250 years. Is that a fair assessment of who they were?
I think auxiliaries is fair, and certainly to the soldiers. You can question what should be done for, Frederick II, but in terms of the soldiers, they really weren't getting anything out of this. They had pay, but it wasn't plunder pay, and their whole life was geared around, as I start the book. Each of them around age 15 had to go to the local pastor, get registered, they were in the army, and that's it. You now spend a month a year training, And if there's a war, and a war meaning that the Landgrave has made a deal to rent you out, then you go out. It's a people's army, but it's very different. I mean, like something like the IDF is a people's army, right? The butchers, the baker, everyone goes into the IDF, but they're fighting for a purpose. Here, they were sent out. They didn't care what the purpose was, and there was even one instance where a group of soldiers got recruited to one side, and another group to another side in a small war. A little embarrassing.
So, reading your book, we always think about the German arrival in the Northeast. Getting to America was a challenge of its own. What did you learn about their journey from Germany to the U.S.?
Their journey was horrifying. Most of these men did not know how to swim. Very few of them had seen anything bigger than a river. At one point, as they're marching to the North Sea, a dam bursts, floods a town, and all you see is the roofs above the water. And a lot of the soldiers thought those were boats. Couldn't even understand the concept of a flood. So I think for the best of us, that trip could be horrifying across the Atlantic Ocean. For the Hessians, it was a nightmare. And, in the book, I give a lot of details. I mean, they have cockfights, they have duels on the ship, right? They have ships colliding all the time. But what always struck me was the storms. When a storm hit, they literally went below and battened down the hatches. And now you had hundreds of soldiers in a large room with bunk beds. But remember, there's no lighting. You can't have a candle down there with a ship going around. So they're in the dark. Some water's getting in, and soldiers are throwing up. So you have vomit and seawater and anything that breaks or breaks loose flying about until the storm stops. And it could go for days.
It makes us grateful for airplanes, I think, at this point for us. All right, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit, Stephen, staying with the order of your book. We get to New York City, Long Island. Tell us that story, from the German viewpoint. What are they doing there? What role do they play? What difference do they make?
They have no idea why they're there. They don't understand what this war is about. It's really hard for them to understand democracy and liberty. And this begins, I should say, gets really emphasized when they first land and they're in Staten Island, and then they'll be in Brooklyn, and they see lush farms far bigger than they'd see back home. They see farms with barns. They're amazed by this. And they see everywhere apple trees, chestnuts, walnuts. They cannot understand, why would these people rebel against their king? And the British were smart. They would hit them with propaganda sitting around the campfire and say to them, look at the different names on all these farms. They're not owned by the king, they're owned by the people. Why would these people rebel? So they go into their first fight with a very negative, confused understanding of what the rebels are all about. Liberty to the Hessians was being loyal to your prince. That was considered liberty. When they land in Brooklyn, it's very anticlimactic. They hit the beaches at Gravesend, which is just a few miles north of Coney Island, and the Americans are gone. They fled. The big battle, of course, at Brooklyn, gets won because Washington makes the mistake of leaving Jamaica Road open on his left flank. So the Hessians don't do that much fighting. But in the fighting they do, most of what happens is they have Americans surrendering to them. And so they're talking to them, trying to understand. And one says, well, I'm the captain, and I'm a school teacher. And they're like, what? And some of these are my students. And this is just mind-boggling to the Hessians. I will say the group that we follow, that becomes Rahl's regiment, right? They do not do any plundering, right? And, it's just fortuitous. I picked 3 soldiers, and all 3 did not do any plundering. But there is definitely a sense of, this place is magnificent. Why would anyone fight?
Well, let's move into maybe when the good times end. We see winter coming. We see an occupation of New Jersey. Of course, George Washington sneaks into Pennsylvania. What did you find during that time period, right really before the great battles that are ahead?
So the King's forces land, of course, in New Jersey, and they begin following Washington, and they see contradictory things happening. For example, there were soldiers, American rebels, leaving Fort Lee. They abandon it. They're marching south. They're in a panic, and some of the Hessians catch up with them. And they're right behind them. They send word back to Cornwallis, get us reinforcements. And the word comes back from Cornwallis, stop. Let them go. And like, what? And then some of the Hessian officers begin to realize we're not here to kill the Americans. They want us here to just break this rebellion with as less blood as possible. And this is very frustrating as a soldier. And this happens on several occasions where the soldiers, the King's troops are in position to attack Washington, and they're held back. Now, as far as the retreat itself, Washington does a masterful retreat, really classic retreat of burn the bridges behind you. He literally burns bridges behind him. He keeps his men together in awful weather. And the Hessians follow in a very slow pace. Not their fault. This is what the British High Command. There are times where, I think it was at Newark, they get through Newark, Washington's fleeing, and he stops and rests for 2 days. I mean, they've only been in New Jersey like a week. And so this was very frustrating. It's a slow moving, and finally they get down to Brunswick, would now be New Brunswick. And they assume winter's coming, it's going to start, this campaign is going to end. Ryle, the regiment that we follow, even gets word to go over to Elizabethtown near the shore, send all your baggage over to New York and start settling in. That's it. It's going to be a campaign. But as we know, this wasn't the end of the fighting in New Jersey.
Okay, so we always hear this story, right? Washington's crossing the Delaware. The Germans are in their beds. They're celebrating. It's Christmas. There's a lot of mythology around this. Stephen, what were the Germans doing in the lead up to Washington's attack at Trenton? What did you find?
When I was writing, facing Washington's crossing, I assumed I was going to get some sort of picture like that. And it was the exact opposite. These men had left their homeland about 6 months ago, did this horrendous voyage across the Atlantic, fought their way through Staten Island, up to the Bronx, up to Westchester, over to Manhattan, over to New Jersey, and then down New Jersey. And they are now sitting at the banks of the Delaware River. Right? They are the most distant outpost. And the town's only about 100 houses. And they're around, about that time, 1,500 troops that have to, they're going to have to make quarters with civilians. A lot of them have fled. Others they're going to stay with and not be really welcome. Others are going to go into some of the mansions along the river. Okay, what do you do now? It's starting to get cold. You're stuck there along the Delaware River. There's no fun to be had in town. Right? Their comrades back in New York are having a ball. They're having parties and balls, and it is miserable. Their clothing is summer clothing, and a lot of it has worn through. And now here comes the worst part. The Americans, and this only I think in the past 10 years or so has really been captured, by historians. The Americans begin basically guerrilla warfare, and it is very effective. It's the classic, if they just kill one person in a raid, that's enough to put the whole regiment into a turmoil. And to counter this, the way that their Colonel Ryle, who's in charge, decided to defend the town was with pickets surrounding the town, pickets further out, horseback pickets circling the town. And this is tiring. If you start doing the math, and now you're down to maybe 1,100 men, there are times that they're up 1 or 2 nights in a row doing picket duty before they get to come back and rest. And because we're on such high alert, they have to sleep in their clothes. So, were they partying? Were they drinking? Were they carousing? No, that's just terrific fiction. I wish I thought of that. I wish it was that way. But, if you read my book, Facing Washington's Crossing, you get that sense. By following the individual soldiers, you can see they're tired. They're beat. They'd be very happy just to sleep through the winter. They're not thinking about crossing the Delaware right now. They're just thinking about getting the heck out of this lousy town.
Absolutely. All right, so you may have answered this, Stephen, but so far the theme of our conversation, and I think a bit of the theme of the book, is that we think we know these people. There's so much we don't know. What's one misconception that you discovered that you wish you could just wipe off of the history books and clear the record? So, does anything stand out to you like that?
I think the idea that they were having Christmas parties and drinking is really so off from what was happening. Colonel Rao did. He got to go into William Trent's house, one of the rich men in town, and sit by a fire and play cards. But he was the exception. The rest of them, the rest of them were just trying to either sleep or get through picket duty in the snow. And I think one of the proofs of this is a few weeks later, when Washington's army does come through, right, to town, they find loads of liquor that has not been drunk, which the Americans proceeded to drink. So if there was that type of party going around, it's unlikely that liquor would have been left like that.
Okay, Stephen, you end the book with this. I think it's worth reviewing. What happens to these men when the war is over? They don't have a lot of stake in the outcome of the war, right? They know very little about it. What do they do upon the conclusion of the revolution?
So they all get brought to Philadelphia. And Congress comes up with a pretty unique idea. They say, instead of putting them in jails, let's give them the opportunity to work, right? They'll work out in farms in the area in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and let them see what the American life is about. And we're going to take a bet that a whole bunch of them are going to decide to stay. And that is precisely what happens. Their time as POWs is pretty nice. One of them, Andreas Wiederhall, was something of a cad, they would say in those days. And he even drank with, partied with, danced with George Washington's niece. And he probably had an affair with her because he all of a sudden had to leave town the next day and skedaddle out. So, and unfortunately, the American prisoners being held by the British were not treated this way. They were treated horrifically. But this was a really cool propaganda. Okay, instead of telling you how great it is, instead of telling you how bad it is, come out, spend the summer with us. Help us pick apples. They do. Most of the soldiers do go back to Hessen Castle. Takes them a few years to get back, and and a great ending, to the book. And one of the several endings I present is that some of them were stuck in the army because what is common to any government, what cannot be beat by any army, bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy doesn't discharge. So, and they're stuck still in the army, but they're home. So most of them went home. Probably about a third of them stayed and lived in America.
The book is Facing Washington's Crossing. Our guest is Stephen Bier. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.